The coffee tasted like disappointment. It was a thin, bitter brew, served in a chipped ceramic mug that had seen better decades. It was the kind of coffee Adrian Sterling would never have allowed to be served in one of his company's cafeterias, let alone his own home. But here in the dim, grease-scented air of the daily grind, it was perfect. It was an essential part of the illusion. He ran a hand through his purposefully unkempt hair, the gesture calculated to look natural weary. He was dressed in a pair of jeans softened and faded by age with a threadbare tear at the knee that his tailor would have a heart attack over. A simple gray t-shirt slightly stretched at the collar completed the ensemble. On his wrist, where a Patek Philippe usually rested, there was only a faint tan line. He was Leo, the struggling artist, and he was on a date. So the woman across from him said, her voice dripping with a boredom she made no effort to hide. Her name was Candace, and she looked as out of place in this dingy establishment as a diamond in a dustbin. Her nails, a shimmering blood-red acrylic, tapped an impatient rhythm on the Formica tabletop. "You paint. Is that like a full-time thing, or just until you find a real job?" Adrian took a slow sip of the wretched coffee. "Art is a real job," he replied, keeping his voice level, adding a hint of gravel he'd practiced in the car. It was the voice of a man who worked with his hands, not with multi-billion-dollar contracts. It doesn't always pay the bills, but it feeds the soul. Candace's perfectly arched eyebrow rose. "The soul doesn't pay for Gucci, Leo." She gestured around the cafe with a flick of her wrist, a silent, damning verdict on his life choices. "I have to be honest. When the matchmaker said you were creative, I wasn't picturing this." This was exactly what Adrian had been hoping for. For 6 months, his grandmother, the formidable matriarch of the Sterling family, had been on a relentless crusade to see him married. She'd paraded a succession of women before him, heiresses, socialites, daughters of board members, all with brilliant smiles and eyes that calculated his net worth before they even learned his favorite color. He was tired of it. He was tired of the gilded cage of the women who saw him as a brand, a walking bank vault. So he'd made a deal. He would go on one more blind date, but on his terms. He would shed the skin of Adrian Sterling and become Leo, a man with nothing to offer but his supposed creativity and a non-existent portfolio. If a woman could see past the poverty, past the worn clothes, and find something worthwhile in the man himself, then maybe he could find something real. Judging by Candace's thinly veiled disgust, this was not that woman. "I'm sorry to disappoint," he said, the apology laced with an irony only he could appreciate. "It's just... What's the endgame here?" she pressed on, oblivious. "Are you expecting some rich patron to discover you? Because let me tell you, the art world is brutal. My father collects Warhols. He wouldn't use one of your canvases to wipe his shoes." Adrian was about to deliver a retort about the soullessness of commercial art when the bell above the cafe door chimed violently. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that made everyone inside jump. A young woman stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. She wasn't dressed for the city. Her simple flower print dress looked handmade, and her dark wavy hair was a beautiful mess escaping from a loose braid. But it was her eyes that captured Adrian's attention. They were wide and luminous, the color of moss after a rainstorm, and they were filled with a raw, primal fear. She stumbled inside, her gaze darting around the small cafe as if searching for an escape route that wasn't the one she'd just come through. "There she is," a gruff voice boomed from the street. 2 men filled the doorway, blocking the light. The older one was thick-set, his face flushed with anger and exertion. The younger one was wiry and mean-looking, his eyes fixed on the girl with a predatory gleam. "Hilara, you get back here right now," the older man shouted, taking a step inside. "You can't run from your duty." The girl Hilara backed away, her hands held up defensively. "Uncle, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling but clear. "I won't do it. I won't marry him." "It's not your choice to make," the younger man sneered, advancing on her. "The deal is done. You'll marry old man Hemlock, and that's final. His money will solve our problems." The entire cafe had frozen. The low murmur of conversation died, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. People stared, some with pity, some with morbid curiosity. Candace looked utterly horrified, as if this display of raw, messy humanity was a personal affront to her sensibilities. Adrian, however, felt a strange, unfamiliar jolt. This was real. This wasn't about Gucci or Warhols. This was about a young woman being hunted, her future about to be sold to the highest bidder. The cynicism that had been his constant companion for years receded, replaced by a clear, cold anger. Ilara continued to backpedal, her eyes searching desperately. They landed on Adrian. For a split second their gazes locked. He saw not a plea for a hero, but the simple desperate need for an exit. Any exit. In that moment, a decision was made. He turned to Candace. "I believe this date is over," he said, his voice dropping the artistic gravel and regaining its natural quiet authority. Before she could respond, he stood up. With a fluid motion that seemed both accidental and deliberate, his elbow caught the edge of a nearby server's tray. A pyramid of plates, glasses, and silverware went airborne. The crash was explosive. Porcelain shattered, glass splintered, and a cascade of metal clattered across the linoleum floor. The cafe's owner let out a howl of rage. Candace shrieked as a splash of ice water hit her expensive leather boots. It was the perfect diversion. Every eye, including those of Ilara's pursuers, snapped toward the source of the chaos. In that single chaotic moment, Adrian looked at Ilara and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen. "Go." Understanding dawned in her terrified eyes. She didn't hesitate. As the owner yelled at Adrian, and her uncle bellowed in frustration at the distraction, Ilara slipped through the door, disappearing from view. "You clumsy oaf!" Candace hissed at him, dabbing at her boots with a napkin. "Look what you've done. This is humiliating." "My apologies," Adrian said, turning his full attention to her. He projected an air of bumbling contrition, which seemed to infuriate her even more. The uncle and cousin finally turned back, realizing their quarry was gone. "Where did she go?" the young one snarled, shoving a table out of his way. He made for the kitchen door, but Adrian, seemingly stumbling as he tried to help clean up the mess, managed to position himself directly in the man's path. "Watch it, pal," the cousin grunted, trying to push past. "Sorry, so sorry," Adrian mumbled, making himself a frustratingly solid and clumsy obstacle. "Everything's so slippery." The uncle grabbed his son's arm. "Forget it, she's gone. We'll find her. Let's get out of this dump." They shot Adrian a final venomous glare before storming out of the cafe, their angry shouts echoing down the street. The storm had passed. The cafe was left in a state of disarray, the floor a minefield of broken ceramic and spilled drinks. The owner was now screaming about paying for damages. Candace stood up, her face a mask of pure fury. "This has without a doubt been the single worst date of my entire life," she declared, her voice trembling with rage. "A filthy cafe, a lecture on the virtues of poverty, and a ridiculous hillbilly soap opera. Lose my number." She turned on her heel and marched out, leaving Adrian alone amidst the wreckage he had created. He reached into the pocket of his worn jeans, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and dropped several $100 bills onto the counter. "For the damages and your trouble," he said to the stunned owner, his voice once again calm and authoritative. Then, without another word, he walked to the kitchen door and pushed it open. The alley behind the cafe was narrow and smelled of garbage and rain. For a moment, he thought she might have kept running. Then he saw her huddled behind a large, overflowing dumpster, trying to make herself small. Her shoulders were shaking. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "They're gone," he said softly. She looked up, her moss-green eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. Relief washed over her features, so potent it was almost painful to watch. You helped me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It looked like you needed it," he said with a small shrug. She got to her feet, brushing dirt from her simple dress. She was taller than he'd thought, and even in her distress she carried herself with a natural, unstudied grace. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, looking at him properly for the first time. She took in his worn clothes, his scuffed boots, the weary set of his shoulders. Her expression softened with a deep, unassuming empathy. "They caused you trouble. And your date." She left. "I'm so sorry." It was the first time in a very long time that someone had apologized to him for something that wasn't their fault. It was the first time someone had looked at him, at this carefully constructed lie, and offered genuine sympathy instead of judgment. "Don't be," he said, and he meant it. She was doing me a favor. He offered a slight smile. "I'm Leo." "Ilara," she replied, a shy but beautiful smile gracing her own lips. "Thank you, Leo." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her bravery, her resilience, and the quiet strength beneath the fear. He also saw that she was completely alone in a city that ate people like her for breakfast. She had nowhere to go. Her hunters could still be out there. The lie came to his lips before he could stop it, born from an impulse he didn't fully understand. It wasn't the CEO of Sterling Enterprises speaking. It was Leo, the struggling artist, the man who had just witnessed something real and didn't want to let it go. "Listen, it's not safe for you out here," he said, his tone gentle. "I have a small studio not far from here. It's not much, just a room where I work, but it's secure. You could stay for a night or two, just until you can figure out what to do next." Alara hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She was a country girl taught to be wary of strangers in the big city. But this man, this Leo, had helped her without asking for anything in return. He had faced down her uncle and created chaos to give her an escape. He looked poor, tired, and a little rough around the edges, but his eyes were kind. In a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly hostile, that kindness was a lifeline. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "I wouldn't want to be a burden." "It's no burden," Adrian assured her, the lie deepening, coiling around him. "It's the least I can do." After a long moment she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." As they walked out of the alley and onto the bustling city street, a strange feeling settled over Adrian. He was leading this innocent, trusting woman into a world of deception. Yet for the first time in years, surrounded by the comfortable anonymity of his disguise, he felt like he was walking towards something true. The CEO was in retreat, and Leo the artist, with a kind heart and a secret, was leading the way. The walk from the cafe was a study in contrasts. For Alara, the city was a roaring, overwhelming beast. The sheer volume of it, the symphony of car horns, the rumble of an unseen subway, the cacophony of 1,000 conversations, was a physical force. She walked close to Adrian, her eyes wide, taking in the towering glass buildings that sliced the sky, and the endless river of faces, each one a story she couldn't read. She felt like a stray leaf caught in a powerful current. And Adrian, the quiet, threadbare man beside her, was the steady stone she clung to. For Adrian, the walk was a different kind of disorienting. He moved through streets he usually traversed in the silent, air-conditioned cocoon of his Maybach. He passed restaurants where he'd closed multi-million-dollar deals, boutiques where he'd bought watches on a whim, and buildings that his company owned. He was a king walking unrecognized through his own kingdom, and the anonymity was both liberating and deeply unsettling. He was hyper-aware of Alara beside him, of the worn fabric of her dress brushing his arm, of the way she flinched at a sudden siren. He felt a fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. He led her away from the main thoroughfares into a quieter, older part of the city, where ivy-covered brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder. Finally, he turned down a narrow lane that seemed to end in a high, ancient-looking brick wall. Tucked into the wall was a heavy, unassuming wooden door. He pulled a simple, old-fashioned iron key from his pocket and unlocked it. "It's just through here," he said, his voice low. The door opened not onto a street, but into a world of curated tranquility. A stone path wound its way through a dense miniature forest of Japanese maples and whispering bamboo. The air was cooler here, fragrant with the scent of damp earth and moss. In the distance, obscured by the lush foliage, one could just glimpse the formidable stone facade of a grand mansion. But Adrian quickly guided her down a diverging path deeper into the trees. "My place is set back a bit," he explained. "I like the quiet." Before them stood what looked like a beautifully converted barn. It was a 2-story structure of weathered gray wood and dark stone, with a steeply pitched roof and a large mullioned window that took up most of the front wall. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. To Alara, who had grown up surrounded by functional, no-nonsense farm buildings, it was the most romantic place she had ever seen. It was an artist's sanctuary. "Oh," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's perfect." Adrian's lips quirked in a smile she couldn't see. Perfect wasn't the word he'd use. Extravagant, perhaps. The weathered wood was imported Siberian larch treated by artisans to achieve that specific silvered patina. The dark stone was hand-hewn basalt from a quarry in Italy. The building had been designed by a Pritzker Prize-winning architect to serve as his personal retreat, a place to escape the suffocating grandeur of the main house. It was a humble cottage, built with a king's ransom. He pushed open the heavy oak door. "Welcome to my humble abode." The interior was a single vast open space soaring to a cathedral ceiling crisscrossed with massive dark wood beams. Sunlight streamed through the enormous front window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and falling across a wide planked wooden floor. A comfortable-looking sofa and 2 armchairs were grouped around a large stone fireplace, where embers still glowed softly. In one corner stood an easel, a canvas draped with a white cloth resting upon it. A flight of wooden stairs led up to a sleeping loft that overlooked the main room. Ilara stepped inside her worn boots, making soft sounds on the floor. She slowly turned in a circle, her eyes taking everything in. She saw the stacks of art books, the scattered charcoal sticks on a workbench, the cozy lived-in feel of it all. She saw an artist's soul made manifest. Adrian, following her gaze, saw something different. He saw the reclaimed 17th century French oak beams he'd had flown in. He saw the hand-knotted Persian rug that looked artfully faded but was in fact priceless. He saw the ridiculously comfortable sofa upholstered in Italian linen, and the fireplace, which ignited with a remote control he kept hidden in a drawer. The entire place was a lie, but it was the most beautiful lie he had ever told. "You're hungry?" he stated, moving toward a kitchenette tucked under the loft. I don't have much. Hope you're okay with something simple." He opened a cupboard, revealing a sparse-looking collection of jars and boxes. He pulled out a package of what looked like instant noodles. Ilara smiled gratefully. Anything would be wonderful. "Thank you." Of course, the noodles were artisanal ramen from a small village in Hokkaido. The dehydrated vegetables were organic, and the broth concentrate was made from slow-simmered pork bones. As he heated water in a surprisingly high-tech induction kettle, he tried to make look old. He chopped some fresh scallions and a soft-boiled egg he found in the meticulously organized refrigerator. He served it to her in a simple hand-thrown ceramic bowl that had cost more than her uncle's entire monthly income. "It's just noodles," he said with a shrug. She took a bite and her eyes closed in pure, unadulterated pleasure. "This is the best thing I have ever tasted," she murmured. They ate in a comfortable silence, the warmth of the food chasing away the last of the day's chill and fear. When they were done, she insisted on helping him wash the dishes in the deep farmhouse sink. As they stood side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, the vast room seemed to shrink, becoming an intimate shared space. Finally, sitting on the sofa, a warm mug of tea in her hands, Ilara began to talk. She spoke of her childhood in a small green valley, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons. She spoke of her parents, a farmer and a schoolteacher who had nurtured her love for painting, buying her cheap watercolors and canvases with what little extra money they had. They had been her world. After they passed in the accident 2 years ago, everything changed. She said, her voice growing quiet, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers in the hearth. "My uncle took over the farm. He's not a bad man. Not really. He's just a weak one. And he's in debt. He sees me, and all he sees is a solution. A way out." She told him about the arranged marriage to a wealthy elderly landowner, a cruel man known for his temper. She had overheard her uncle and cousin finalizing the price. That was when she had packed a small bag with her sketchbook and what little money she had and fled. Adrian listened, his heart aching with a strange mix of rage and compassion. He had dealt with greedy, weak men his entire life in the boardroom, but their machinations had never felt this visceral, this personal. "You're very brave," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She shook her head. "I was just terrified. There's a difference." She looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. "What about you, Leo? What's your story?" He was prepared for this. He had a narrative crafted. "Nothing as dramatic as yours," he began, leaning back. "Grew up in the city. Never really fit in. Found my escape in drawing. My parents, they wanted something more stable for me. A trade, an office job. We didn't see eye to eye." He let a shadow of old pain cross his features. "I've been on my own for a while now, just trying to make a living doing the one thing I love." The lie was woven from threads of his own truth. The loneliness, the parental pressure, the feeling of being an outsider in his own life, it was all real. He was just presenting it through a different lens, a different tax bracket. And because it was rooted in real emotion, Ilara felt it. She saw a kindred spirit, another soul fighting to live on their own terms. "I understand," she said softly. Later, she shyly showed him her sketchbook. Adrian, who had seen the great works of the world in private museum viewings, was genuinely stunned. The small pages were filled with life. There were charcoal sketches of wind-whipped trees, their branches twisting like agonized dancers. There were portraits of old farmers, their faces maps of hardship and resilience. There was a raw, untamed talent in every line, a powerful voice waiting to be heard. "These are incredible," he said, his voice hushed with genuine reverence. "You have a gift, Ilara." Her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Thank you. Can I "Can I see your work?" His heart skipped a beat. He led her to a large portfolio case leaning against the wall. He opened it and pulled out several large sheets. They were not paintings, but intricate architectural drawings rendered in black ink. Plans for a new sustainable art museum his foundation was funding. He'd been working on them here in his sanctuary. "I've been exploring something a little different lately," he said, passing them off as an artistic experiment. More abstract, structural. She studied them, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the clean, precise lines with her finger. "They're like skeletons of buildings," she mused. "You see the world in lines and forms and angles. I see it in colors and light." She looked up at him, a brilliant smile illuminating her face. "But I think we're trying to capture the same thing, the truth of a thing, its essence." Her insight struck him with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever understood his work, his true passion, so instantly and intuitively. His business partners saw profit margins. His family saw legacy. This girl, this stranger, saw the soul within the structure. As the night deepened, they talked for hours. They talked about art, about music, about the color of the sky before a storm, about the feeling of being lonely in a crowded room. Adrian found himself laughing, a real, unforced laugh that seemed to come from a part of him he'd thought long dormant. He felt seen. He felt happy. And with that happiness came a wave of guilt so profound it almost stole his breath. This perfect moment, this genuine connection was built on a lie. Every time she looked at him with those trusting, empathetic eyes, she was looking at a phantom. She wasn't admiring Adrian Sterling, the ruthless CEO. She was connecting with Leo, the gentle, impoverished artist. What would happen when she found out they were one and the same? The trust in her eyes would turn to revulsion. The connection would sever. He excused himself for a moment, stepping out into the cool night air. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the manicured wilderness of his estate. He looked back at the warm golden light of the studio window. Inside was a woman who had in the space of a few hours made him feel more real than he had in a decade. And he was deceiving her. He had run from his world seeking truth only to build a new world for himself out of lies. When he returned, he found her curled up on one end of the sofa, fast asleep, her sketchbook resting on her chest. Her face in repose was peaceful, all traces of fear gone. She looked young and impossibly vulnerable. He walked over to a large wooden chest and pulled out a heavy blanket. It was a cashmere throw, absurdly soft and expensive, but in the dim light he hoped it would pass for simple wool. He gently draped it over her, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. Her skin was soft. He stood there for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He had saved her from her uncle, but who was going to save her from him? The sanctuary he had offered her was also a cage, and the truth was the key that would either set her free or destroy everything he was beginning to feel. The morning broke soft and tentative, spilling pale golden light through the studio's massive window. Ilara awoke slowly, cocooned in the warmth of the cashmere blanket on the sofa. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't wake with a jolt of fear, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt a profound, unfamiliar sense of peace. The air was still scented with the faint, pleasant aroma of wood smoke and turpentine. The silence wasn't the empty, lonely silence of her abandoned farmhouse. It was a peaceful, protective quiet. She sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. Across the room, Leo was already awake. He stood by the window, his back to her, a charcoal stick in his hand, as he sketched in a large notepad. The morning light sculpted his form, highlighting the broad set of his shoulders and the intense focus in his posture. He was utterly absorbed in his work. In that unguarded moment, she saw not just a struggling artist, but a man possessed by a deep and quiet passion. He must have sensed her gaze because he turned, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "I hope you slept well." Like a stone, she admitted, her cheeks warming slightly. "I can't remember the last time I felt so safe." The word hung in the air between them, imbued with a significance that went far beyond four simple walls. He gave a slight nod, his eyes holding hers for a moment, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a complex mixture of warmth and a deep, shadowed sadness. He prepared breakfast, another deceptively simple meal of thick sliced toast with fresh avocado and perfectly scrambled eggs. As they ate, a comfortable rapport began to build between them, the easy rhythm of two people discovering common ground. They talked about painting, about the frustrations of a blank canvas, and the pure, transcendent joy of capturing a perfect moment in color and line. "I'd like to paint you sometime," Alara said suddenly, looking at him with a painter's critical eye. "Your portrait. There's a lot of character in your face, a lot of conflict." Adrian nearly choked on his coffee. Him a portrait. His face was one of the most recognizable in the corporate world. A portrait by this woman with her terrifyingly perceptive talent would be a disaster waiting to happen. He imagined the painting hanging in a gallery, some savvy business reporter recognizing the bone structure beneath the scruffy beard and blowing his entire charade wide open. "I'm not much of a model," he demurred, forcing a self-deprecating laugh. "Too restless. You're better off painting those trees outside. They have more patience." The peaceful bubble they had built around themselves felt so real, so wonderfully solid, that neither of them was prepared for the sound that shattered it. It started as a distant rumble, the sound of a vehicle coming up the private lane far too quickly. Adrian's head snapped up, his posture instantly alert. It wasn't the quiet purr of his own cars, or the discreet electric hum of the estate's service vehicles. This was a growling, poorly maintained engine. His phone, which he'd set to silent, vibrated in his pocket. He discreetly pulled it out below the level of the table. A single encrypted text from Marcus, his head of security, unidentified commercial van at East Gate. 2 individuals matching previous description plus 1 unknown male. Aggressive entry. Awaiting instruction. A cold, razor-sharp fury sliced through Adrian. They had found her. He'd underestimated their desperation. His mind raced, processing variables and outcomes with the speed of a supercomputer. He couldn't call the police. It would expose his identity and terrify Alara. He couldn't use his security team openly for the same reason. He had to handle this as Leo would, a tough, street-smart artist protecting his space. He typed a swift coded reply to Marcus Stage 2. "Passive containment. Landscapers and stonemason. Await my visual signal." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face a calm, unreadable mask. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice tight with renewed anxiety. She had heard the vehicle too. Probably just a delivery for one of the neighbors. Adrian said, his tone deliberately casual. He stood up and began clearing their breakfast plates. "Hey, I have a favor to ask. I'm working on a sketch of the way the light falls through the rafters in the loft. Could you go up there and stand by the railing for a minute? I need to get the perspective right." It was a flimsy excuse, but his calm demeanor was reassuring. Alara, though still nervous, nodded and made her way up the wooden stairs. From the loft she could see the entire main room, but she would be largely hidden from anyone standing at the front door. Just as she reached the railing, a violent percussive banging erupted from the heavy oak door. It wasn't a knock. It was an assault. Bang, bang, bang. Alara froze, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. It was them. "Alara, we know you're in there, girl." Her uncle's voice, Silas bellowed through the thick wood. "Open this door." Adrian looked up at Alara, his expression hardening. He put a finger to his lips, a clear command for silence, then pointed to the back of the loft away from the railing. "Stay hidden." He watched until she had retreated into the shadows before turning to face the door. He took a deep breath, letting the polished veneer of the CEO fall away, replaced by the grit and steel of a man who had nothing to lose. He swung the door open. Silas and Jed stood on the stone steps, their faces contorted with rage. Behind them stood a third man, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a flat, brutal face. He wore a cheap leather jacket and had the dead-eyed stare of a man who broke things for a living. The loan shark's muscle. "Well, well," Silas grunted, trying to peer past Adrian into the studio. "The little lovebird's nest. Where is she, you bum?" Adrian didn't raise his voice. He simply filled the doorway, a quiet, immovable object. "This is private property," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You need to leave. Now." "We're not leaving without my niece," Jed sneered, taking a step forward. He tried to shoulder his way past Adrian, but it was like running into a stone wall. Adrian didn't seem to move yet. Jed found his path completely blocked. "She's not here," Adrian lied smoothly. "Don't play games with us." Silas's voice rose, his face turning a blotchy red. "We know she's in there. We're her family. We're taking her home." "She told you she doesn't want to go," Adrian replied. That should be the end of the conversation. The hulking man behind them cracked his knuckles, a sound like snapping twigs. "Maybe the artist here needs a more persuasive conversation." he growled, a menacing smile spreading across his face. This was the moment. Adrian subtly shifted his stance, a prearranged visual cue. He let his gaze drift past the three men out into the trees as if looking for help he knew wouldn't come. From the woods to the left, a man in dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat emerged, carrying a heavy-looking shovel over his shoulder. He began to leisurely turn the soil in a flower bed not 20 feet from the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at the confrontation, but his presence was a palpable weight. A moment later from the right, another man appeared. He was powerfully built, wearing a leather apron and carrying a stonemason's mallet in one hand. He began to tap methodically at a loose stone on the garden wall, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the mallet against stone providing a steady, unnerving beat to the standoff. Silas and Jed took a nervous step back. The city was one thing, but this secluded, quiet place suddenly felt very different. It felt like a territory, and they were unwelcome intruders. "What's this?" Silas stammered. "Who are these guys?" "Neighbors," Adrian said simply. "We're a pretty tight-knit community out here. We look out for our own. And we don't much like loud, angry strangers threatening one of our friends." Just then, another figure strolled down the path from the direction of the main road. He was a man in his 50s with a calm, authoritative air. He wore a simple windbreaker and durable boots, looking for all the world like a park ranger or an estate groundskeeper. It was Marcus. "Everything all right here?" Leo Marcus asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He nodded politely to the landscaper and the stonemason. "Morning, Bill." "Frank." "Morning, Marcus." The two men grunted in unison, never stopping their work. Marcus turned his placid gaze on Silas and his companions. These gentlemen causing a problem. The word problem seemed to hang in the air like a threat. Silas looked from the man with the shovel to the man with the mallet, and then to Marcus, who projected an aura of unshakable authority. He looked at Adrian, who hadn't moved an inch, his expression still one of cold calm. This wasn't some weak, starving artist. This was something else. This was a man with backup, a man who was part of a pack. Silas's bluster evaporated, replaced by the craven fear of a bully who has just realized he's picked the wrong fight. "No," he mumbled, shaking his head. "No problem. We were just looking for someone. Wrong address." "Easy mistake to make," Marcus said pleasantly. "You have a good day now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Silas grabbed Jed's arm, and the three of them practically scrambled over each other in their haste to retreat. They backed away down the path, casting fearful glances over their shoulders, and disappeared into the trees. The growl of their van's engine starting up was followed by the squeal of tires as they sped away. The stonemason finished his tapping. The landscaper shouldered his shovel. They gave Adrian a single brief nod of acknowledgement before melting back into the woods as silently as they had appeared. Marcus gave Adrian a look that was a mixture of a question and a statement, situation contained, before continuing his leisurely stroll down the path. Silence descended once more, broken only by the chirping of birds. Adrian closed the door, the tension draining from his body, leaving a profound weariness in its place. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood for a moment, his eyes closed. He had protected her, yes, but he had done it using a web of deception, commanding his silent army with coded texts and subtle glances. The chasm between Leo and Adrian had never felt wider or more treacherous. He heard a soft footstep on the stairs and turned. Ilara was standing on the bottom step, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly before her. She had seen it all from the shadows of the loft. She walked toward him, her steps hesitant. She didn't look frightened anymore. She looked awestruck. "How did you do that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't even raise your voice. But they were terrified of you." He tried for a casual shrug. "Like I said, we look out for each other here." But she wasn't buying the simple explanation. She looked at him with new eyes, her artist's gaze seeing beyond the worn clothes to the man beneath. She saw the quiet confidence, the strategic mind, the effortless command he projected. This was not just a kind man. This was a powerful one. His strength wasn't in his fists. It was in his stillness. "They're gone for good, aren't they?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. "They won't be back, I promise." She believed him. In that moment, she believed he could hold back the tide if he promised to. The last vestiges of her fear washed away, replaced by a feeling that was deeper and more potent than simple gratitude. She felt an anchor in the storm of her life. and it was him. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed for a second under her touch before relaxing. It was a small, simple gesture, an acknowledgement of the battle he had just won for her. But for both of them, it felt like a seismic shift. The line between protector and protected, between stranger and confidant, had just been irrevocably blurred. She was safe. He had made sure of it. And as he looked down at her small hand on his arm, Adrian knew with a sinking, soaring heart that he was in more danger than he had ever been in his life. A fragile peace had settled within the walls of the studio. The days that followed the confrontation with Alara's relatives unfolded with a quiet domestic rhythm that was new and intoxicating to them both. The vast, high-ceilinged space, once just Adrian's solitary escape, was now filled with a shared life. It smelled of Alara's oil paints and the wild herbs she'd found on the estate grounds, a scent that Adrian found he preferred to the most expensive designer fragrances. He would watch her for hours, pretending to be engrossed in his own architectural sketches. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration, the smudge of ultramarine blue that always seemed to find its way onto her cheek, the fierce, joyful light that entered her eyes when a painting began to come to life on her canvas. She was painting with a feverish intensity, pouring all her fear relief and newfound hope into her art. The studio was becoming her sanctuary, too. In turn, she would watch him. She saw a man who was gentle and surprisingly domestic, who made her coffee in the morning and insisted on washing the dishes after their simple meals. She also saw the man who could command the respect of his rough-looking neighbors with nothing more than a quiet word, a man who carried a deep well of stillness within him. She was falling for Leo, the struggling artist, a man of fascinating contradictions, never suspecting that the greatest contradiction of all was his very existence. They were in their bubble, a world of two, and it felt unbreakable. Until the text message arrived. Adrian was sitting by the fire, reading while Alara worked at her easel. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. His heart stopped. The message was from his grandmother, Eleanor Sterling. "Dearest, I find myself in your part of town. I've decided to pop by for a cup of tea and to see this studio of yours. Should be there in 20 minutes. Do try to look presentable." 20 minutes. The words exploded in his brain like a series of detonations. He felt the blood drain from his face. 20 minutes until the formidable eagle-eyed matriarch of the Sterling clan, a woman who could spot a fake pearl at 50 paces, descended upon his carefully constructed fiction. He shot to his feet, his mind a maelstrom of frantic calculations. He looked around the room and suddenly everything screamed wealth. The rustic, humble studio was a veritable minefield of luxury. The cashmere throw was still draped over an armchair. The imported single-origin coffee beans sat in a clear glass jar on the counter. The sleek, state-of-the-art sound system, cunningly disguised as a vintage 1940s radio, was playing a soft classical piece. Even the damned firewood, perfectly seasoned oak, looked too expensive. "Leo, what is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Alara asked, lowering her paintbrush. Her expression clouded with concern. "Worse," he croaked. "My grandmother. She's coming. Here. Now." "Oh, that's wonderful," Alara said, her face lighting up. No, it's not wonderful. It's a catastrophe," he said, running a hand through his hair in genuine panic. He had to think fast to create a plausible reason for his meltdown. "My grandmother, she's eccentric, very old-fashioned. She has this romanticized idea that for an artist to be authentic they must suffer. She despises comfort. She thinks luxury is a corrupting influence. If she sees anything nice, she'll think I've sold out. She'll cut me off." Alara's eyes widened. She had no reason to doubt him. It was an odd story, but artists were supposed to be odd, and their families even odder. "What do we do?" she asked instantly, his co-conspirator. "We hide the evidence," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Operation Destitution is a go." What followed was 10 minutes of controlled chaos. Adrian, the cool strategic CEO, was replaced by a flustered stage manager frantically trying to redress a set before the curtain went up. The blanket, he hissed, snatching the cashmere throw and shoving it deep into a wooden chest. "She can spot a high thread count through solid oak." He dashed to the kitchen. "The coffee beans. It's like serving liquid gold. Where's the instant stuff?" "The what?" Alara asked, bewildered. "Instant coffee. The terrible powdered kind. Poor people drink." He made a frantic whispered call to Marcus. I need a jar of the cheapest, foulest instant coffee you can find, and I need it delivered by a man dressed as a plumber 2 minutes ago. And Marcus, intercept my grandmother at the east gate. Tell her you're fixing a burst pipe. Stall her." Alara, caught up in the bizarre urgency of it all, rushed to help. She hid the expensive-looking ceramic mugs and replaced them with 2 chipped enamel ones Adrian found at the back of a cupboard. He grabbed a stack of rare first-edition art books from a shelf. "These have to go. The binding is too good." He shoved them under the sofa cushions and replaced them with a few dog-eared paperbacks. He unplugged the sound system and frantically tried to find the hidden remote control for the fireplace to conceal it. Just as a man dressed in overalls sprinted up the path, handed Adrian a jar of Monarch brand instant coffee, and sprinted away, the purr of a classic Bentley could be heard coming up the lane. "She's here," Adrian breathed, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. He took a deep breath. "Remember, we are poor, we are suffering, but we are happy." "Got it." Alara nodded, her eyes bright with a mixture of nervousness and amusement. "Got it. Suffer beautifully." A moment later, the door opened. Eleanor Sterling was not a woman who simply walked into a room. She made an entrance. She was in her late 70s, tall and slender, dressed in a Chanel suit the color of cream, with a single strand of perfectly matched pearls at her throat. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her eyes, the same piercing blue as her grandson's, missed absolutely nothing. "Adrian, dearest," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as marble. She glided into the room, her gaze sweeping over the space in a single comprehensive scan. "So this is the hovel you've chosen for your artistic exploration." Adrian forced a smile, stepping forward to kiss her cheek. "Grandmother, it's good to see you. This is my friend Alara." Alara stepped forward, wiping her hands nervously on her dress. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sterling." Eleanor turned her gaze to Alara, and the younger woman felt as though she were being X-rayed. The older woman's eyes took in her handmade dress, the paint smudge on her cheek, and the open, honest sincerity in her expression. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Eleanor's eyes. "The pleasure is all mine, my dear," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Can I get you some tea?" Grandmother Adrian asked, steering her toward one of the armchairs, praying she wouldn't notice it was far too comfortable. "Or coffee. We have a new instant brand. Very bracing." "Tea will be fine," Eleanor said, settling into the chair with the elegant grace of a queen ascending her throne. As Adrian busied himself in the kitchen, Eleanor's attention remained fixed on Alara. "So, my dear Alara," she began, her tone light but her questions precise. "You are an artist as well." "I'm trying to be," Alara said honestly. "Leo has been kind enough to let me share his space." "Has he now?" Eleanor mused, her eyes twinkling. "And how did you two meet? It's so rare for Adrian for Leo to let anyone into his little world." Alara recounted the story of their meeting at the cafe, editing out the more terrifying details of her family situation, but conveying her gratitude for Leo's timely intervention. She spoke of his kindness, his focus, and his generosity. Adrian brought the tea served in the chipped enamel mugs. Eleanor accepted hers, taking a delicate sip without so much as a grimace. Her gaze fell upon the large canvas on Alara's easel. It was a landscape of the woods surrounding the studio, but it was more than just a depiction of trees. Alara had captured the soul of the place, the quiet strength, the dappled, ever-changing light, the sense of ancient peace. "May I?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward the painting. "Of course," Alara said. Eleanor rose and walked to the easel. She stood before the canvas for a long, silent moment. Adrian held his breath. His grandmother was a renowned patron of the arts, with a famously discerning eye. Her opinion could make or break a career. "Extraordinary," Eleanor said at last, her voice quiet with genuine admiration. "You have a remarkable talent, child, a true honest-to-God gift. You don't just paint what you see, you paint what you feel." She turned back to Alara, and all suspicion seemed to have vanished from her face, replaced by a look of profound respect. "Don't let anyone, especially not this brooding grandson of mine, tell you that you must suffer to create. Great art comes from great passion, not from fabricated poverty." She shot a pointed look at Adrian over Alara's head. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. Eleanor, completely charmed by Alara, asked to see her sketchbook and listened intently as Alara spoke about her dreams. The two women, separated by decades and billions of dollars, connected on a fundamental level, a shared love for beauty and a deep appreciation for genuine talent. When it was time for her to leave, Eleanor took both of Alara's hands in her own. It was a great pleasure to meet you, Alara. I hope we will see each other again very soon. At the door, she gave Adrian a final knowing look that sent a chill down his spine. Well, Adrian, she said, her voice too low for Alara to hear. The studio is surprising, but the company is exceptional. She patted his cheek. Don't mess this up. And then she was gone, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and palpable relief in her wake. Adrian leaned against the closed door, his legs feeling weak. They had done it. They had passed the ultimate test. She's wonderful, Alara said, her face glowing. But she's much smarter than you give her credit for, Leo. I don't think she believes for a second that you're suffering. The relief that had flooded Adrian's system began to curdle, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Alara was right. His grandmother hadn't been fooled, not really. She had seen the truth, not the whole truth perhaps, but enough. She had seen the quality of the light, the perfection of the construction, the invisible hum of luxury that permeated the very air in the studio. And she had seen Alara, and she had approved. Don't mess this up. His grandmother's words echoed in his head. But how could he not? The entire foundation of his relationship with Alara was one giant mess, a beautiful, fragile house of cards. Today he had managed to keep it from collapsing, but the close call had shaken him to his core. He couldn't keep this up. The lie was a constant, exhausting performance. Sooner or later he would make a mistake. A receipt would fall out of his pocket, a business associate would stumble upon them, or he would simply call her by the wrong name. The bomb was ticking. He looked at Alara, who was now happily dabbing paint onto her canvas, humming a soft tune. He loved the sight of her, the way she existed so fully and honestly in the world. He was in love with her. The realization hit him not with the flutter of wings, but with the dead weight of a stone. He, Adrian Sterling, was in love with a woman who believed he was Leo, a penniless artist. The lie had been his tool to find her, his shield to get close to her. But now it had become his prison. The truth would be a betrayal she might never forgive. But to continue the lie felt like a deeper betrayal still. He was trapped. And for the first time, the man who had a solution for everything had absolutely no idea what to do. The days following Eleanor Sterling's visit were idyllic. A new rhythm had taken hold, one of quiet creativity and deepening affection. The fear that had once been Alara's constant companion had receded, replaced by a burgeoning confidence that bloomed under Leo's steady, encouraging gaze. Her canvases, once filled with the melancholy beauty of her past, now exploded with color and life. She was painting the world as she now saw it, a place of sanctuary and unexpected kindness. Adrian watched this transformation with a feeling of profound pride, which was always swiftly followed by a pang of gut-wrenching guilt. He was the architect of her happiness, but the foundation was a lie. He found himself treasuring the small, mundane moments of their life together, the shared silence as they both worked, the easy laughter over a burnt piece of toast, the way she would absent-mindedly hum when she was mixing colors. Each perfect moment was a jewel he knew he had no right to possess. One evening, as they were looking through an art magazine together, he pointed to a page announcing an upcoming showcase for emerging artists at the Argent Gallery. "You should submit something," he said, his tone deliberately casual. Alara laughed, a soft, self-deprecating sound. "Leo, that's one of the most prestigious galleries in the city. They wouldn't look twice at a painter with no training and no connections." "Don't say that," he said, his voice firm. He tapped a picture of a bleak, minimalist painting that was featured in the magazine. "Your work has more soul in a single brush stroke than that entire canvas. You have to try. The worst they can do is say no." He encouraged her for days, helping her select her 3 strongest pieces, building her a sturdy crate for transport, and even driving her to the gallery in a borrowed, beat-up pickup truck he'd had Marcus procure for the occasion. What she didn't know was that the Argent Gallery was one of Sterling Enterprises' many cultural holdings. A single discreet phone call from Adrian to the gallery's director, an old university friend named Julian Vance, had ensured her submission would not only be accepted but given a place of honor. When the acceptance letter arrived a week later, Alara stared at it, her hands trembling. She read it 3 times before letting out a cry that was half sob, half shout of pure joy. She threw her arms around Adrian's neck, and he held her tightly, burying his face in her hair to hide the complex emotions warring on his face. Her dream was coming true, and he was the phantom benefactor, a ghost pulling strings from the shadows. The night of the gallery opening was a blur of surreal wonder for Alara. With the money she'd earned from a small landscape commission, a sale Adrian had secretly arranged through a proxy, she had bought a dress. It was a simple midnight blue slip dress that shimmered under the light, its elegance lying in its perfect, simple cut. When she came down from the loft, her hair pinned up to reveal the graceful line of her neck, Adrian felt all the air leave his lungs. He who was accustomed to women dressed in haute couture had never seen anyone more beautiful. He, Leo, in his cleanest dark shirt and least faded jeans, felt entirely unworthy. The gallery was another world. It was a cavern of white walls and polished concrete floors, filled with a low-cultured hum of conversation. Men in tailored suits and women who dripped quiet elegance drifted from one piece to another, glasses of champagne in hand. Alara felt a surge of panic, a country weed suddenly transplanted into a pristine greenhouse. But Adrian's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady. "You belong here," he whispered, his voice a firm anchor in her sea of nerves. "Your work belongs here." And he was right. Her 3 paintings hanging in a prime position on the main wall commanded attention. They were a jolt of raw, untamed nature in the cool, intellectual space. Her centerpiece, a depiction of the woods around the studio at dawn, was a masterpiece of light and shadow imbued with a palpable sense of hope and peace. People stopped. They stared. They spoke in hushed, appreciative tones. Julian Vance, a man with a charming smile and impeccably tailored suit, came to greet them. He shook Alara's hand warmly. "Your work is the talk of the evening, Miss Alara. Truly magnificent." He gave Adrian a quick, almost imperceptible glance. "Leo, glad you could make it." Alara was floating. She spoke to art critics who used words like visceral and luminous. She met other artists who welcomed her into their fold. Then she saw it. A small, circular red sticker was placed on the wall next to her centerpiece. "What does that mean?" she asked Adrian, her voice a whisper. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile of pure pride. "It means it's sold." Tears welled in her eyes. It was all too much. All the lonely years of painting in her parents' barn, all the fear and uncertainty had led to this one perfect, unbelievable moment. She turned to Adrian, her heart overflowing. "This is because of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never would have had the courage." "No," he said softly, his thumb gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "This is all you." He was a masterful liar, but in that moment he believed his own words. This triumph was hers and hers alone. Julian beckoned to him from across the room, a discreet but urgent gesture. "I'll be right back," Adrian promised Alara. "Don't move." Alara watched him go, feeling as though she were the star in her own private fairy tale. She drifted through the crowd, content to simply listen to the murmur of conversations, to soak in the atmosphere of her dream made real. She found herself near a quiet alcove where 2 large sculptures stood like silent sentinels. From behind one of them, she heard Julian's smooth voice and the crisp, aristocratic tones of an older woman. "Julian, you've outdone yourself," the woman said. "This new painter, the girl from the country, is a true find. Our anonymous benefactor must be absolutely thrilled." Alara froze, an unseen eavesdropper. Julian let out a sigh that sounded both weary and amused. "Mr. Sterling has a truly exceptional eye for talent. He was very specific in his instructions. He wanted to give a deserving artist a chance without the usual market pressures. Said he was tired of art that already knew its own price tag before the paint was even dry." A cold tingling sensation started at the base of Alara's neck. "Mr. Sterling." The woman chuckled, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "That sounds just like an old Sterling family crusade. I saw dear Eleanor at a charity luncheon just last week. She mentioned her grandson Adrian was holed up in some artistic hovel on the estate trying to find himself. I suppose this brilliant young woman is the fruit of that particular soul-searching." Eleanor Sterling, Adrian. The names detonated in the quiet space of Alara's mind. The air turned thin and sharp, and the happy hum of the gallery faded to a distant roar. The fairy tale shattered the pieces, falling around her like sharp, glittering shards of glass. Sterling, the last name of Leo's formidable grandmother. A woman he had claimed was a traditionalist who despised comfort, but who had in fact been a shrewd art connoisseur who spoke of passion, not poverty. Adrian. A name she had never heard before yet. It felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Her mind, which had been blissfully blank just moments before now, raced, connecting disparate points with horrifying speed. The neighbors, Bill and Frank, who had appeared like loyal soldiers to defend them. The seamless way every problem seemed to resolve itself around Leo. The impossible luck of getting a prime spot in the most exclusive gallery in the city on her very first try. His studio, a place that felt more like a handcrafted dream than a struggling artist's workshop. A wave of nausea washed over her. Nothing added up. The simple, beautiful story of her life with Leo, a story she had come to cherish as her own, was suddenly riddled with holes. It wasn't a story. It was a stage play. And she was the only one who didn't know her lines. She backed away from the alcove before they could see her, her movements stiff and robotic. She found a deserted corner of the gallery, turning to face a painting on the wall without seeing it, using it as a shield. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a painful question. Who is he? Who is Leo? Who is Adrian Sterling? She tried to rationalize it. It had to be a coincidence. There could be other Sterlings, other men named Adrian. But the confluence of details, Eleanor the estate, the secret benefactor, was too perfect, too damning. The puzzle pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with an audible, soul-crushing click. She scanned the crowded room until she found him. He was standing near the entrance, talking to Julian. He caught her eye, and his face broke into that warm, familiar smile, a smile that had been her son for the past few weeks. He gave her a small, encouraging nod, but the smile looked different now. Was it a mask? Was the warmth a lie? The trust that had become the bedrock of her new life crumbled, turning to sand beneath her feet. Every kind word he had ever said, every gentle touch, every shared moment, was now suspect, tainted by the possibility of an elaborate, unimaginable deception. He finished his conversation and began walking toward her, his expression shifting from a polite social mask to one of genuine concern as he got closer and saw her face. "Ilara, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice low for her ears only. "You're as pale as a ghost. Are you feeling overwhelmed?" She looked up at him, at the man she had trusted with her safety, her art, her heart. She looked into his kind, worried blue eyes and saw a stranger. The triumph of her evening, the greatest moment of her artistic life, had turned to ash in her mouth. She forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing. "Yes," she said, and the single word was a monumental effort. Just a lot to take in. He took her hand, his own warm and strong, but for the first time his touch felt alien. She was standing beside the man who had saved her, but she had never felt more lost. The drive back from the gallery was suffocating. The borrowed pickup truck, which had felt like a charming part of their adventure on the way there, now felt like a cramped, rattling cage. Adrian gripped the steering wheel, the knuckles of one hand white, while the other hand rested uselessly on the seat between them. He wanted to reach for her to close the cavernous silence that had opened up, but a palpable, invisible wall had risen between them. Ilara stared out the passenger window, her body angled away from him. The city lights smeared across the glass, a chaotic blur of color that mirrored the turmoil in her mind. She was silent, but her silence was a living thing, heavy and sharp-edged. "Did you have a good time?" he asked finally, his voice sounding loud and clumsy in the tense quiet. "It was a night I'll never forget," she replied, and the words were perfectly chosen, a double-edged sword of truth. Adrian's instincts, honed by years of reading the subtle shifts in a boardroom, screamed that something was profoundly wrong. This wasn't the happy, overwhelmed exhaustion of an artist basking in her first success. This was something else. Something had broken inside her, and he had no idea what it was. Had a critic been cruel? Had the pressure been too much? He cycled through a dozen possibilities, but the one truth that mattered remained entirely outside his realm of suspicion. When they arrived back at the studio, he killed the engine and the silence rushed back in, thicker than before. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows through the trees, and the warm, welcoming light of the studio seemed like a distant beacon. Inside, the atmosphere of cozy sanctuary had evaporated. It felt like a stage after the audience has gone home, the props and backdrops revealed for the cheap constructions they really were. Ilara didn't take off her coat or move toward the fire. She walked to the center of the room and turned to face him, her expression stripped of all its earlier joy, leaving only a stark, painful clarity. "The gallery owner, Julian." She began, her voice steady but unnaturally low. "He's a good friend of yours, isn't he?" Adrian's heart gave a single hard thud against his ribs. The question was too specific, too direct. "He's an acquaintance," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "An acquaintance." Her laugh was a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. An acquaintance you can get to hang the work of a complete unknown in the most prominent spot of the year's most important showcase. She took a step closer, her moss-green eyes searching his pleading with him to give her a reason to believe. He was talking to a woman. He mentioned his benefactor, a Mr. Sterling. The name landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. Adrian felt the floor drop out from under him. The moment he had been simultaneously dreading and denying had arrived. Your grandmother's name is Eleanor Sterling. Alara continued, her voice beginning to tremble, the pieces clicking into place with audible finality. She came to visit her grandson. Adrian. Is that also your name? Is Leo even real? His carefully constructed world, his beautiful lie was shattering. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. Ilara, he began, his voice raspy. He took a step toward her, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. Please just let me explain. It's not what you think. Then what is it? She demanded, her voice rising. What could it possibly be? Bravo, a voice drawled from the open doorway. A truly magnificent performance. I must say I'm impressed. They both spun around. A man was leaning against the doorframe, his form cloaked in shadow. He pushed himself off and stepped into the light, bringing with him the chill of the night and an aura of predatory amusement. He was tall, dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to his body, and his smile was a sharp, unpleasant slash in a handsome face. Adrian's blood ran cold. Blackwood, he bit out. Damien Blackwood, the CEO of Blackwood Industries, Adrian's chief rival, and a man who took a sociopathic pleasure in the misfortunes of others. Sterling Damien returned, his eyes glittering with malice. He ignored Adrian and let his gaze sweep over Alara, a slow, insulting appraisal that made her skin crawl. And you must be the lovely Alara, the latest acquisition. Tell me, has he let you in on the secret, or is the grand reveal part of the thrill? Ilara stared, utterly bewildered. Adrian moved to place himself slightly in front of her, a protective instinct he couldn't suppress. Get out, Blackwood, Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. This has nothing to do with you. Oh, I think it has everything to do with me. Damien purred. I've been watching your little game for weeks, Adrian. The great titan of industry playing the starving artist in his rustic little love nest. It's been wonderfully entertaining. But all good things must come to an end. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Not with a threatening gesture, but with the languid, deliberate motion of a magician about to perform a trick. He produced a glossy, folded magazine. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the heavy oak coffee table between them. It slid across the polished surface and came to a stop directly in front of Alara. It was the latest issue of Forbes. On the cover, a man stared out with an expression of cool confidence and absolute power. He was clean-shaven, his dark hair perfectly styled, and he wore a dark suit that was the epitome of corporate armor. The headline screamed in bold block letters, "The Midas Touch: How Adrian Sterling Built a Global Empire." The man on the cover was Leo. Alara's breath hitched in her throat. It was him. There was no doubt. The same intense blue eyes, the same strong jawline, the same man she had shared meals with, laughed with, and trusted with her life. But this was not Leo, the gentle, struggling artist. This was a king on his throne, a complete and utter stranger. The world seemed to tilt and swim before her eyes. The studio, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. He isn't a painter, my dear Damien Blackwood said, his voice a silken, poisonous whisper, enjoying every second of the devastation he was causing. He's the CEO of Sterling Enterprises. He could buy this entire city block and not even notice the charge on his account. This charming studio. It's a multi-million-dollar guest house on his 30-acre estate. Those neighbors who so conveniently came to your rescue. His private security detail. And your spectacular debut at the gallery tonight. He paused for effect, letting the cruelty land. A trifle, a bauble, a little amusement he bought and paid for just to see the look on your face. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile reality she had built. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. She wasn't a partner in a shared dream. She was a project, an experiment, a plaything for a bored billionaire. Ilara, listen to me, Adrian said, his voice ragged with desperation. He turned on Blackwood, his face a mask of fury. You twisted, manipulative bastard. Me. Damien feigned a look of shock. I'm not the one who created a fake identity and lied to a woman for months. Did you or did you not lie about your name? Your profession? Your entire life? Did you not orchestrate this entire pathetic little romance novel for your own entertainment? Ilara flinched, the words striking her with the force of a slap. She looked at Adrian, her eyes swimming with tears, begging him silently to deny it. To tell her this was all a lie, a terrible joke. But he couldn't. The core of Blackwood's accusations, the scaffolding of the lie, was entirely true. I lied. Adrian admitted, his voice breaking. He took a pleading step toward her. I lied about who I am, Ilara. But not why. He's twisting it. I did it because I was so tired of the world I lived in, of people who only saw my name, my money. I wanted to find something real. His confession, which might have sounded romantic under other circumstances, now sounded like the most pathetic self-serving excuse she had ever heard. He was admitting that he had used her as a test, a litmus strip, to prove some philosophical point to himself. Something real. She finally whispered, her voice hollow and broken. She bent down and picked up the magazine, her knuckles white as she gripped the glossy cover, the face of the stranger she had loved staring up at her. And was I real enough for you, Mr. Sterling? Was I an authentic enough experience for your research? The tears that had been threatening now fell hot and fast. They weren't tears of simple sadness. They were tears of rage, of betrayal, and of a humiliation so profound it felt like it was dissolving her from the inside out. Ilara, no, he begged. Don't. She choked out, holding up a hand to stop him. She couldn't bear to hear another lie, another explanation that would only make it worse. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she threw the magazine at his feet. It landed with a soft, pathetic slap on the priceless Persian rug. Stay away from me, she sobbed. She turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get out of that room, out of that lie. She fled out the open door and into the cold, uncaring darkness of the night, leaving Adrian standing frozen in the middle of his perfect, shattered world. He was alone with the ruins of his creation, the mocking, triumphant smile of his rival. The last thing he saw before the weight of what he had done came crashing down upon him. The night air was a shock of cold against her heated, tear-streaked skin. Ilara ran without direction, propelled by a force more primal than thought. Each footfall on the gravel path was a painful punctuation mark in a sentence of betrayal. The rustling leaves of the perfectly manicured trees sounded like whispers of mockery. The elegant landscaped beauty of the estate, which had once felt like a magical secret garden, now seemed like the opulent bars of a gilded cage she had been too blind to see. She didn't know how long she ran, only that her lungs burned, and the thin soles of her dress shoes offered no protection against the sharp stones. She was running from him, from the studio, from the beautiful, suffocating lie. She burst through the unassuming wooden door in the brick wall and found herself on the silent city street, the fairy tale dissolving behind her like mist. The city which she had viewed with wonder just hours before now seemed monstrous. The towering buildings were menacing silhouettes, the streetlights cast a harsh, interrogating glare, and the distant wail of a siren sounded like a cry of despair. She was alone. More alone than she had been when she'd first fled her uncle's farm, because then she had been running toward an unknown hope. Now she was running from a hope that had been proven false. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin fabric of her blue dress, a pathetic defense against the encroaching chill. The dress itself felt like a costume from a humiliating play in which she had been the unwitting lead. Every compliment she had received at the gallery, every person who had admired her work, now seemed like a paid actor in a production orchestrated by Adrian Sterling. Back in the studio, the sound of Ilara's fleeing footsteps faded, replaced by a silence so absolute it was a physical weight. Damian Blackwood lingered for a moment, a connoisseur of destruction, admiring his handiwork. "Such a shame," he said, with a lazy, satisfied smirk, picking an imaginary piece of lint from his perfect suit. "She was quite charming. You always did have a taste for the authentic Adrian. Your one true weakness." He gave a small mocking bow and departed, his laughter echoing softly in the doorway before he disappeared into the night. Adrian stood frozen, his world narrowed to the single damning object on the floor, the Forbes magazine. His own face stared up at him from the cover, the confident, powerful image of a man who had everything and valued nothing. It was the face of the monster she now believed him to be. A strangled cry tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony. His first instinct, the primal command of his heart, was to fix it. He bolted from the studio, his mind screaming her name. He ran out onto the stone path, calling her name into the darkness, his voice raw and desperate. "Ilara, please wait." But the only answer was the rustling of the leaves and the distant hum of the city. He ran all the way to the gate, but the street beyond was empty. She was gone. He stood there, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire in his chest, surrounded by the vast, silent kingdom he had built for himself. And in its crushing emptiness, he had never felt so poor. Ilara walked for what felt like miles, her initial frantic panic solidifying into a cold, hard knot of grief in her stomach. She was on autopilot, moving through the unfamiliar streets, her mind replaying the evening's events in a torturous loop. Every memory of her time with Leo was now poisoned. His kindness was condescension. His encouragement was manipulation. Their shared moments of quiet understanding were merely the careful observations of a scientist studying a specimen. The small clutch purse she carried contained the money from the sale of her painting. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The very symbol of her triumph was the fruit of his deception, but it was also her only means of survival. She eventually found herself in a less glamorous part of the city where the streets were narrower, and the lights of liquor stores and laundromats cast a weary glow. She saw a sign for a motel, its neon letters buzzing and flickering erratically. The Starlight Inn. It looked anything but. It looked like a place where hope went to die. It was perfect. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. A brown-patterned bedspread covered a lumpy mattress, and the window looked out onto a brick wall. The contrast with the airy, beautiful studio was so stark it was almost comical. She locked the door, slid the chain across, and leaned her back against the cheap wood. And then, in the safety of that sordid, anonymous little room, she finally allowed herself to break. The grief she had been holding at bay washed over her in a tidal wave. Sobs racked her body, raw and convulsive, for the man she had loved, for the dream she had believed in, and for the naive fool she had been. She wasn't just heartbroken. She felt profoundly, deeply stupid. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had stolen her judgment, making her question her own ability to see the truth in anything. While Ilara's world shrank to the four walls of a motel room, Adrian's had become a prison of his own making. He paced the studio like a caged lion, the beautiful objects that surrounded him now serving as instruments of torture. He saw Ilara everywhere. He saw her sitting on the sofa, her head bent over her sketchbook. He saw her by the fire, her face illuminated by the flames. He saw her at the easel, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of her oil paints hung in the air, a ghostly accusation. He tried her phone again and again. Each time the call went to voicemail, her soft, hopeful voice answering in the recorded message, it was like a fresh stab to the heart. He, Adrian Sterling, a man who could get the president of any country on the line with a single call, could not reach the one person in the world he needed to speak to. He had never known such complete and utter powerlessness. A sudden, violent rage overtook him. With a roar of pure frustration, he swept his arm across the large workbench, sending charcoal sticks, sketch pads, and jars of brushes crashing to the floor. He picked up a heavy art book, one of the rare editions he had so frantically hidden from his grandmother, and hurled it against the wall. The sound of its spine cracking echoed the breaking of something inside him. But the violence brought no relief, only a deeper, hollower ache. He slumped into the armchair where she had so often sat, burying his face in his hands. Damian Blackwood's words replayed in his mind. "Your one true weakness." Blackwood was wrong. Ilara hadn't been his weakness. His weakness was the lie. He had built it as a fortress to protect himself from the superficiality of his life. But a fortress keeps things out as much as it keeps them in. He had walled himself off from the possibility of being trusted, of being known. He had wanted to find someone who could see the man, not the money. And when he had found her, he had, through his own cowardice, made it impossible for her to see anything but a lie. In the bleak motel room, Ilara's storm of tears eventually subsided, leaving behind the cold, desolate landscape of reality. She pushed herself off the floor and walked to the grimy bathroom mirror. She looked at her reflection, the tear-swollen eyes, the smudged makeup, the beautiful dress that now looked like a borrowed costume. She saw a victim, and a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She would not be this person. He had taken her trust, but he would not take her strength. He had made a fool of her, but he would not break her. She was the girl who had survived the loss of her parents, who had stood up to her greedy family, who had fled into the unknown with nothing but a sketchbook and a sliver of hope. She was a painter, and he could not take that from her. She walked back into the room, her movements now filled with a quiet resolve. She took her small sketchbook and a single stick of charcoal from her purse. She sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, the buzzing neon light from the sign outside casting lurid shifting colors on the page. And with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she began to draw. She didn't draw the beautiful woods or the dramatic landscapes of her past. She drew the motel room, its ugliness, its loneliness, its truth. She would paint her way through the pain. It was the only way she knew how. Miles away in a studio that was now just a silent, beautifully decorated tomb, Adrian finally looked up from his hands. His gaze fell on her easel. On it rested the half-finished painting she had been working on that morning, a canvas filled with impossible light and vibrant, joyful color. It was the world she had seen when she was with him, a world he had been lucky enough to be invited into, and a world he had with his own hands burned to the ground. The day after Alara vanished, Adrian Sterling returned to his real life. He walked into the gleaming minimalist lobby of Sterling Tower, and the world snapped back into its familiar configuration. Employees straightened their ties, their whispers ceasing as he passed. His executive assistant met him with a tablet and a litany of urgent decisions. The market was waiting. The empire needed its king, but the king was a ghost. He sat in his penthouse office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking a city he owned a significant piece of, and felt nothing but a profound and absolute hollowness. The power at his fingertips, the ability to move billions with a single word, felt like a child's toy. It was useless. It could not turn back time. It could not unsay the lies. It could not bring her back. He had spent the night in the studio, a self-imposed exile in the ruins of his own creation. He had not slept. At dawn, a new terrible clarity had settled over him. His first instinct had been to use his power to find her, to bring her back, to force her to listen. But he saw with sickening certainty that such an act would only prove Damian Blackwood's twisted version of the story correct. It would be the act of a possessive billionaire, not a repentant man. It would be the final, unforgivable violation. He had to let her go, but he would not let her be unprotected. He summoned Marcus to his office. His head of security entered his face a perfect professional blank, betraying none of the chaos he had witnessed over the past few weeks. "Find her," Adrian said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual commanding tone. "Use every resource we have, but your instructions are absolute. Once you have her location, you will establish a perimeter of total non-interference. She is not to be approached. She is not to be spoken to. She must never under any circumstances know that she is being watched. Your team will be invisible. Their only purpose is to ensure she is safe from harm. Am I clear?" Crystal, Sir Marcus replied, his expression unchanging. "Second," Adrian continued, turning to stare out at the sprawling city, "I want a complete file on Silas and Jedediah Thorne. Their finances, their associates, their debts, every vulnerability. I want them neutralized, permanently." A flicker of something perhaps grim satisfaction passed through Marcus's eyes. "Consider it done." While Adrian was redeploying his empire, Alara was building a new life from scratch. After the first night of raw, unfiltered grief in the bleak motel room, a cold, hard resolve had taken root. She would not drown. She used a portion of the tainted money from her painting sale to rent a room. It was a tiny box-like apartment above a noisy bakery in a part of the city that tourists never saw. The plumbing rattled, the single window looked out onto a graffiti-covered wall, and the entire place smelled perpetually of yeast and frying oil. It was hers. She spent her first 2 days in a fever of activity. She bought a cheap second-hand mattress, a single pot, a fork and a spoon. Her biggest expenditure was on art supplies, large cheap canvases, bulk tubes of acrylic paint, and a set of stiff, serviceable brushes. She ate stale bread and cheese and drank tap water. Her existence was stripped down to its barest essentials: survival and art. Her painting, which had been her joy in the studio, now became her exorcism. The canvases filled not with light-dappled forests, but with the stark, emotional honesty of her new reality. She painted the fractured reflection of the buzzing neon sign in a puddle of grimy water. She painted the view of the brick wall from her window, imbuing it with a sense of oppressive finality. Her work grew darker, edgier, and more powerful than anything she had ever done before. She poured her heartbreak, her humiliation, and her stubborn, unyielding will to survive onto the canvas. She found work washing dishes in a greasy spoon diner down the street. The hours were long, the pay was abysmal, and the work was mind-numbing. But at the end of each shift, her hands raw and her body aching, she would return to her tiny room and she would paint. The exhaustion and loneliness were a constant presence, but her art was a defiant roar against them. 2 weeks into her new life, Adrian sat in his boardroom, a thick legal file open before him. His lawyers had been efficient. Silas and Jedediah Thorne were not just in debt, they were drowning in it, owing a considerable sum to a particularly vicious loan shark. Through a labyrinth of shell corporations, Adrian bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. He was now their sole creditor. He instructed his legal team to draw up an agreement. It was a simple, brutal contract. In exchange for the complete and total forgiveness of their crippling debt plus a modest lump sum that would allow them to relocate and start over, they would sign a legally binding document. It stipulated that they would relinquish any and all familial claims on Alara Thorne. They would never again attempt to contact her, approach her, inquire about her, or even speak her name to any third party. The penalty for breaching the contract was not just the reinstatement of the original debt, but financial ruin so complete their family name would be erased from every ledger in the state. In a dusty lawyer's office 200 miles away, Silas and Jed signed the papers with greedy, trembling hands. They saw it as a miracle, a divine intervention that had solved all their problems. They had sold Alara's future once for a pittance, and now they had unknowingly sold their connection to her forever for their own salvation. Adrian closed the file. He felt no pleasure, only the grim satisfaction of a surgeon excising a cancer. The first shadow over her life had been removed. She was free of them. Alara's dishwashing job barely covered her rent and supplies. She needed more. She swallowed her pride and found a spot in a small, slightly run-down city park, where local artisans and students sold their wares. She sat on a small rickety stool with her sketchbook propped on an easel, a small hand-lettered sign at her feet. Portraits, $10. It was a humbling, soul-crushing experience. Tourists would haggle over the price. People would watch her draw for 10 minutes and then walk away without a word. She was exposed, vulnerable, her talent reduced to a cheap commodity. But she persevered. She had a gift for capturing not just a person's likeness, but their essence, and for every 10 people who walked by, one would stop captivated. She earned enough to buy better food to ease the constant gnawing anxiety in her stomach. She never noticed the quiet, bearded man in a faded army jacket who sat on a bench across the park each day, seemingly engrossed in a newspaper. He was one of Marcus's best men, an expert in unobtrusive surveillance. His job was to ensure that no one gave Alara any real trouble. A would-be purse snatcher was subtly tripped. A belligerent drunk was quietly persuaded to move along by the sudden appearance of 2 large, unfriendly-looking men. Alara simply thought she was lucky. Marcus's daily reports to Adrian were concise and clinical, but they painted a vivid picture that tormented him. He saw Alara, the brilliant artist whose work had stunned a gallery, now sketching cartoons for tourists to make enough money for rent. He knew he could end her struggle with a single anonymous wire transfer. But he also knew it would be a violation. It would be him, the billionaire, playing God again. A handout would only reinforce the power dynamic he had come to despise. He had to create an opportunity, not charity. An open door, not a golden cage. He made a call to the dean of the Northwood Academy of Art, one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. A week later, the Northwood Academy announced the establishment of a new transformative scholarship, the Peregrine Grant. It was an unprecedented award, funded by a massive, anonymous endowment. It would be given to a single emerging artist each year who displayed a singular, powerful, and independent voice. The grant covered full tuition, private studio space, a housing stipend, and a generous living allowance. It was in the art world a winning lottery ticket. The selection was to be made by a small, unimpeachable committee of art scholars and renowned artists. But Adrian, through the dean, gave the committee its first confidential tip. A few days later, a distinguished woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a cascade of silver hair was taking a stroll through the city park. This was Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned art historian and the head of the Peregrine Grant Selection Committee. She had been skeptical of the tip, but had agreed to see for herself. She paused seemingly by chance near the young woman doing charcoal sketches. At first, she was simply impressed by the technical skill, but as she watched Alara work, she saw something more. She saw an economy of line that was masterful in ability to convey profound emotion with a few simple strokes. This was not a street artist. This was a master in disguise. "Excuse me," Dr. Finch said, her voice warm but authoritative. "Your work has a remarkable quality. Do you have any other pieces? Any paintings, perhaps?" Alara, wary of strangers, hesitated. But there was a genuine scholarly intensity in the woman's eyes that was compelling. She found herself nodding. "I have some back in my room." Dr. Finch walked with Alara back to the tiny apartment above the bakery. When Alara opened the door and the professor stepped inside, she stopped dead. The room was no longer just a room. It was a gallery. Canvases were stacked against every wall, a stunning, powerful collection of her work from the past month. Dr. Finch was speechless. She was looking at a body of work that was raw, painful, and undeniably brilliant. It was the visual diary of a soul in turmoil, rendered with a skill and passion that was breathtaking. She turned to Alara, her expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "My dear girl," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I am the head of a committee for a new grant, the Peregrine Grant. We are searching for a singular new voice in the art world." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope containing the application forms. "I believe," she said, her eyes shining as she looked around the room at the stunning paintings, "our search may be over." That evening, Alara sat on her lumpy mattress, the application forms spread out before her. It felt like a sacred text, a passport to a different life, a future she thought had been stolen from her. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like a reward. It felt like fate. For the first time since that terrible night, a pure, unadulterated flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. She believed her talent, her hard work, her suffering had led her to this moment. High above the city in his silent office, Adrian received a one-line text from Marcus. "The package has been delivered." He felt no sense of victory, only the deep, hollow ache of his self-imposed exile. He had set her on a new path, a brilliant path that would lead her to the recognition she deserved. But it was a path that led further and further away from him. It was the only gift he could truly give her, and it was his penance. 6 months at the Northwood Academy of Art had remade Alara. The timid, uncertain girl who had arrived with a single bag and a portfolio of painful memories was gone. In her place stood an artist. Her world was now one of cavernous, light-filled studios, the scent of linseed oil, and the intellectual rigor of her tutors and peers. She thrived. The Peregrine Grant had given her more than just financial security. It had given her the freedom to dedicate every waking moment to her craft. She absorbed technique like a sponge, her raw talent now being honed and polished into something truly formidable. She made friends engaged in fiery debates about art theory, and for the first time in her life, felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was healing. The sharp edges of her heartbreak had softened, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache. The memory of Leo was something she kept locked in a distant room in her heart. He was a ghost, a painful lesson in the cruelty of the world, a mystery she had decided was better left unsolved. She was moving forward. Her peace was disturbed by a course assignment. For her Art and Society seminar, she was tasked with researching the structure and funding of a major philanthropic organization within the art world. The choice was obvious. She decided to investigate the foundation behind the Peregrine Grant, the anonymous force that had so miraculously changed her life. At first, the research was a dead end. The foundation was a masterclass in legal and financial discretion. It was a ghost in the system, its charter designed to protect the anonymity of its benefactor at all costs. But Alara, armed with the Academy's extensive research databases and a painter's eye for detail, was persistent. She followed the trail of public records, tracing the grant's funding through a complex web of charitable trusts and holding companies. After a week of late nights in the library, she found it. A single, almost invisible thread. The initial seed money for the Peregrine Grant Foundation had come from a much larger, well-established trust dedicated to urban renewal. And the primary and very public benefactor of that trust was a name that made the air in her lungs turn to ice. Sterling Enterprises. She stared at the name on the microfilm reader, the glowing letters seeming to burn into her retina. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. Sterling was a massive corporation. Its philanthropic arm must be vast and impersonal. It meant nothing. But it wasn't nothing, because she remembered the elegant, imposing woman who had visited the studio. Eleanor Sterling. She remembered the name the cruel man in the suit had used. Adrian. She remembered the name on the Forbes magazine cover. Adrian Sterling. The old wound which she had so carefully stitched shut tore open. The questions she had buried alive clawed their way back to the surface. But this time the confusion was not colored by the raw humiliation of betrayal. It was a deep, unsettling enigma. If he had meant to simply play a cruel game, why would he continue to pull strings in her life? Strings that had led her to this incredible opportunity. The narrative of the bored, manipulative billionaire didn't fit. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but they formed a picture she could not comprehend. The Alara of 6 months ago would have run from this revelation. But the woman she was now, confident and tempered by her own resilience, needed answers. There was only one person she could think of who stood at the crossroads of her two lives, the man who had greeted Leo and Alara with the same knowing smile. She found the business card for the Argent Gallery that she had kept from her exhibition. She dialed the number, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. When Julian Vance's smooth, professional voice answered, she was surprised by how calm her own was. She asked if he might have time for a coffee, that she had some questions about navigating the world of art philanthropy. Julian, who had received a discreet call from Marcus once a month for the past 6 months, knew this day would come. He agreed immediately. They met in a quiet, sun-drenched cafe far from the gallery district. Julian looked the same, impeccably dressed and exuding an air of easy charm. He greeted her warmly, congratulating her on the rave reviews her work was receiving at Northwood. Alara didn't waste time with small talk. After the coffee arrived, she looked him directly in the eye. The Peregrine Grant, she said, her voice clear and even. It was him, wasn't it? The foundation is funded by Sterling Enterprises. It was Adrian's money. Julian Vance did not seem surprised. He took a slow sip of his espresso, studying her face. He saw not the wounded, fleeing girl from that terrible night, but a poised, intelligent woman seeking not retribution, but truth. He made a decision. Adrian's penance of silence had gone on long enough. Yes, he said simply, it was Adrian. Alara let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Why, she whispered. Julian leaned forward, his expression serious, his voice losing its socialite's polish and taking on the sincerity of a true friend. To understand why, you have to understand the man Adrian was before he met you. Imagine living your entire life in a room full of mirrors, where every person you meet only shows you a reflection of your own wealth, your own power, your own name. He was the loneliest man I knew. He was drowning in cynicism. He used to say he felt like a ghost in his own life, that no one had seen the real him since he was a boy. He told her about the Leo persona, not as a cruel game, but as a desperate, last-ditch effort to find something genuine. It was a clumsy, foolish, and yes, a deceitful thing to do, Julian admitted. But it wasn't malicious. He wasn't playing with you, Alara. He was trying to see if it was even possible for someone to see him, the man underneath the brand. And then he found you, and you did. You saw the good in a man who had started to believe he had none left. He then told her about the aftermath, about the Adrian he had seen in the days and weeks after she had vanished. Devastated doesn't even begin to cover it. I've seen that man lose $100 million deal and not even blink. But losing you, it broke him. He locked himself away. He wouldn't speak to anyone. He wasn't a CEO who had made a miscalculation. He was a man who had lost the only thing he ever truly valued. He confirmed everything she had suspected. Adrian had been the one to neutralize her relatives, ensuring they could never bother her again. And he had created the grant. He knew he couldn't come to you. He knew any apology would sound self-serving, and any offer of help would feel like an insult. He'd lost the right to be in your life. Julian explained, his voice soft with sympathy. So he did the only thing he could. He decided to give you the future you deserved, a future you could build on your own terms. He wanted to give you the freedom he felt he had stolen from you. It was his way of saying he was sorry. It was his atonement. Alara listened to the entire narrative of her past year, shifting and reforming around this new, painful, beautiful truth. The image of the villain, the cold, manipulative billionaire, dissolved. In his place stood a different figure, a desperately lonely man who had made a monumental, hurtful mistake in his search for love. The lie was not a weapon he had used against her, but a shield he had used to protect a fragile, vulnerable part of himself. She remembered the deep shadowed sadness she had sometimes seen in Leo's eyes, and finally understood its source. She remembered his kindness, his unwavering belief in her talent, and saw it now not as part of the act, but as the only real part of his performance. It was Adrian, not Leo, who had seen her. Her anger, which she had nurtured for months as a protective shell, simply melted away. In its place was a wave of emotions so complex she couldn't name them: a profound sorrow for the depth of his pain, a sharp, renewed ache for the genuine connection they had lost, and a quiet regret for her own part in it all. She had been so blinded by the betrayal of the lie that she had refused to listen to the truth of his heart. Miles away, Adrian sat in the silent, sterile perfection of his office. A file lay open on his desk. It was the digital catalog for the upcoming Northwood Academy Fall Exhibition. The dean, an old acquaintance, sent it to him as a courtesy. The cover of the catalog was a single, stunning painting. It was a self-portrait by Alara. In it, she was standing in her small, bare studio. Her expression, not one of sadness, but of fierce, quiet determination. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, looked directly at the viewer, unflinching and clear. She was not the victim he had feared he'd created. She was a survivor. She was a force. A surge of pride so fierce it was almost painful rose in his chest, followed by the familiar crushing weight of his loss. Alara left the cafe and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The city she had once seen as hostile and later as a place of anonymous survival now looked different again. It looked like a place of possibility. The story wasn't over. The lies had been stripped away, and the truth, though complicated and painful, was finally clear. He had built a wall of deception between them, and she had built a wall of anger in return. But walls could be torn down. Julian's final words echoed in her mind. He never stopped loving you, Alara. He just decided that your freedom and your happiness were more important than his own. She now understood the depth of his sacrifice. He had given her everything she needed to build a life without him, but for the first time she wondered if that was a life she still wanted. The power which had been so cruelly taken from her that night in the studio was now finally in her hands. She had a choice to make. She looked down the long city street, a path that had once seemed to lead only forward away from the past. Now she realized it could also lead back. She knew what she had to do. The decision once made settled in Alara's heart with a quiet, solid weight. There was no turmoil, no second guessing. For 6 months she had been a ship charting a new course in stormy waters, and she had proven she could captain her own vessel. But now she saw a lighthouse on a distant shore she had thought long abandoned, and she knew she had to sail toward it not for rescue, but for a destination. She did not go to the gleaming steel and glass monument of Sterling Tower. That was Adrian's world of power, a place where he was a king, and she would be a visitor. She did not go to the magnificent estate, a place whose beauty was forever tainted by the memory of the lie. She went back to the beginning. The Daily Grind Cafe looked exactly the same. The sign was still faded, the windows were still grimy, and the air inside still smelled of burnt coffee and old regrets. It was a place frozen in time, a perfect unchanging stage for a story that needed its final act. She chose her seat carefully, the booth in the back corner, the one with the tear in the red vinyl upholstery. The very same booth where a struggling artist named Leo had first seen a terrified girl running for her life. She ordered a cup of the terrible coffee, and as she wrapped her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, she felt a sense of calm inevitability settle over her. She took out her phone. She didn't have his number, but she had a better tool, his empire. She sent a text message to the general public contact number for Sterling Enterprises, a digital Dropbox monitored by a team of assistants. The message was simple, unsigned, and for one person only. The Daily Grind, 3 p.m., if you want to talk. High above the city in a boardroom on the 80th floor, Adrian Sterling was in the middle of closing a deal worth more than the GDP of a small country. He was surrounded by his sharpest executives and a team of formidable lawyers. He was in his element, a master of a universe he had created. His personal assistant entered the room silently and placed a tablet in front of him. On it was Alara's text flagged as an anomaly of the highest priority. He read the 7 words, and the world stopped. The voices of his executives faded to a meaningless buzz. The numbers on the screen in front of him dissolved into static. The Daily Grind. 3 p.m. It was a summons from a ghost, a message from a life he thought he had lost forever. Without a word of explanation, without a single glance at the stunned faces of his board members, Adrian Sterling stood up, pushed his chair back and walked out of the room. He left the billion-dollar deal hanging in the air. He left his empire without its king. In that moment, none of it mattered. The drive to the cafe was a frantic, heart-pounding journey through a city he barely saw. His mind was a tempest of fear and a fragile Bugan Shangshin to hope. Was this a final confrontation? A chance to say a proper goodbye? Or was it impossibly something more? He didn't know, and the not knowing was a sweet, terrifying agony. He pushed open the cafe door and the cheap bell chimed the same sound that had heralded her entrance into his life 6 months ago. His eyes scanned the dim room and found her. She was sitting in the corner booth, a cup of coffee untouched before her. She was no longer the frightened girl in the handmade dress. She was not the humiliated victim from the gallery. She was a woman. Poised, self-assured, her inner strength now a quiet, visible aura. She looked up as he approached, and her moss-green eyes were clear, steady, and held no trace of fear. He walked to the table, his movements stiff, his heart feeling too large for his chest. He looked down at her, seeing the woman she had become, and felt a wave of awe and shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had nearly destroyed this magnificent person. He slid into the booth opposite her. He looked nothing like the powerful CEO on the magazine cover, nor the scruffy artist he had pretended to be. He just looked like a man stripped of all his armor, his face etched with the pain and regret of the past 6 months. He was utterly, completely vulnerable. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of everything that had happened, every lie, every truth, every moment of joy, and every second of pain. He was the first to speak, his voice rough as if pulled from a place of deep disuse. "Alara, I don't know what to say." She offered him a small, sad smile. "Then let me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know, Adrian, about the grant, about my uncle, about why you did it." She told him everything she had learned from Julian, laying the truth out on the table between them like a map of their shared, complicated past. "The lie was wrong," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It hurt me in a way I didn't think was possible to be hurt. For a long time I hated you for it. I hated you for making me feel like a fool." He flinched but accepted the words as the punishment he deserved. He did not look away. "But I don't think the man who told that lie was a monster," she continued, her voice softening. "I think he was just a man who had been alone for so long, he forgot how to let someone in through the front door. I think he was just lonely." Adrian listened, overwhelmed. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, for a final deserved condemnation. He had not prepared himself for grace. He had not prepared himself for understanding. When she finished, he took a deep, shuddering breath. He did not offer excuses. He did not try to justify his actions. He simply owned them. "What I did was selfish," he said, his voice raw, with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It was cowardly and unforgivable. I built a world of lies, and I trapped you inside it all because I was too afraid to be honest. There is no excuse. Nothing I can say will ever change the fact that I hurt you, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. I am sorry, Alara. So profoundly sorry." He looked at her, his blue eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I lost the right to ask anything of you the moment I introduced myself as Leo." Alara looked at the man across from her, the real Adrian Sterling, stripped bare of all his wealth, his power, and his deceptions. And in his pained, honest eyes, she finally saw him. She saw the man she had fallen in love with all along, the kind, passionate, and deeply sad man who had been hiding inside the artist's costume. "I spent the last 6 months building a new life for myself," she said, her voice steady and clear. "A life without you. And it's a good life. I'm proud of it. I have my art, my school, my friends. I don't need you, Adrian." A flicker of pain crossed his face, a final acceptance of his fate. He nodded slowly. "I know." But she continued, and a small, tentative smile touched her lips for the first time. "I have a feeling it might be an even better life with you in it." Hope so powerful and bright it was almost blinding flared in Adrian's eyes. He looked at her, unable to speak, afraid to breathe. If she said, her expression turning serious, her voice imbued with the strength she had earned. "If we can build it together. No more lies, no more secrets, no more grand gestures from the shadows. Just you and me. The real you and the real me. On level ground. Tears he had held back for 6 long months finally spilled over, tracking a path down his face. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He reached across the table, his hand trembling, and laid it palm up on the scarred formica. An offering. A plea. After a long moment, Alara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were strong and sure, calloused from her work, and they intertwined with his. It wasn't a spark. It was a connection reforged in the fires of pain and forgiveness, stronger now for having been broken. Just us, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They left the cafe together, walking out of the dim, memory-filled space and into the bright, clear light of the afternoon sun. They left behind the ghosts of Leo the artist and Adrian the king. They were simply a man and a woman, their hands linked, their future an unpainted canvas. It was not a fairy tale ending written in the stars, but something far more precious, a real beginning earned, chosen, and built, finally on a foundation of truth. True love is not a perfect, unbroken thing. Sometimes it is a mosaic pieced together from shattered fragments. Adrian's lie, born of loneliness, broke the trust between them. But Alara's strength, her willingness to look beyond the hurt to the heart of the man who caused it, allowed them to gather the pieces. They learned that the deepest connections are not forged in flawless perfection, but in the messy, difficult, and beautiful work of forgiveness. Their story was a testament to a simple, profound truth that our real worth is not determined by the name we carry or the money we possess, but by the honesty of our hearts and our courage to rebuild what has been broken. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. We hope it touched your heart and gave you something to reflect upon. Stories like these remind us that no matter how complicated life gets, the simple values of kindness, honesty, and forgiveness will always light the way. If you enjoyed this journey, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us to continue bringing you more stories that we hope will add a little warmth and meaning to your day. Thank you again for your time and your attention. We wish you all the very best.